Jesus, for your patience. Okay, so we just talked about specifically the love of God and it being expressed outwardly, the necessity of it being expressed outwardly, and we talked about two forms of that expression and the depth of that expression in terms of the martyrs and also the confessors of the church, those who have suffered a great deal for the sake of the faith, though they may not have lost their life. They're certainly willing to sacrifice everything for the love of Christ. Though we may not be called to be martyrs or confessors, brothers and sisters, our love for God ought to be no less extreme. We are called to live our own kind of martyrdom. We are called to put to death the old man which lives within us, to die unto sin, to those sinful inclinations which are buried deep within our soul. It is sin above all which stands between us and God. Thus, if we are to do battle with sin and cast it out of our lives, we must have in our hearts the love of God to inspire us in our struggle. Love has two properties, according to St. Kosmas. First, it gives man strength to do what is good, and second, it weakens his resolve to do what is evil. We are all equally called to make God our first love, letting no earthly thing come between us and him. For as Christ himself says, "He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." Our love for God then ought to dominate our lives. But how do we know that we've begun to acquire such love? To measure this, Metropolitan Augustinus of Florina, of blessed memory, suggests that we should look for signs indicative of love shared between two people. So he's going to use the image of love between two people as a way of sort of checking our love for God. Love, he begins, does not remain a mystical feeling in the heart, but manifests and externalizes itself. We desire to meet our beloved as often as possible, to see the person's face and to hear his or her voice. We rejoice when we hear our beloved one praised, but are saddened, angered, and defensive upon hearing any negative comment. We do all that pleases our beloved and carefully avoid anything that displeases him or her. We love the friends of our lover and detest any enemies. We think about this person day and night. We hang our beloved's photograph prominently in our room. We passionately seek to please this person, and if the person is a fiancé, then, burning with love, we await our wedding day. Does this not happen with people in love? His Eminence then asks, take this then as a criterion for measuring and examining yourself. See if there are similar manifestations of love in you for him who is worth loving more than any lover. Now you'll notice here that in this last passage I've read to you from Metropolitan Augustinus, that he says a sign of love is that love which we have, is that love, those loved by the one we love, is that we love, in other words, those who are loved by the one whom we love. We ought to love those loved by God then. Though God must be our first love, he is not to be our only love. In fact, according to St. John the Latter, he who loves the Lord has first loved his brother, for in the latter is proof of the former. Love of neighbor is evidence. It is a natural extension of our love of God. If we love God, we will naturally love our neighbor with whom we share our common nature, with whom we share one baptism, with whom we share one faith, with whom we receive the same sacred mysteries, and we hope to enjoy the exact same paradise. St. John Chrysostom puts this another way. Imagine, he says, if a person were to have a beloved child, a child for whom he would give up his life. Now imagine a second person who loved this father, but paid no attention to the father's beloved son. Would the father not be angered by this? This is like God, who has all of us as his beloved children. Can it possibly be pleasing to God for us to claim to love him and yet mistreat his beloved children? If we truly love him, will we not love the ones whom he loves? If we love God, we will naturally love our neighbor then. But what does this look like in practical terms? Christian love of neighbor does not remain on a theoretical level, but has a necessarily practical dimension. Returning to St. Kosmas, he reminds us that I can only claim to love someone if I give him bread when he is hungry. I can only claim to love him if I console him, if I sympathize with him when he loses a loved one. I can only claim to love him if I clothe him when he is impoverished. Christian love, then, is something that requires effort on our part. It's not some vague emotion, the thing we see depicted in romantic comedies. When Christ was asked what one must do in order to inherit eternal life, he gives a seemingly simple answer. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. But as we have seen today, true love of God with the whole heart takes a profound awareness of all that God has done for us, which in turn inspires us to avoid those things which might come between us and him. This love will in turn naturally spill out into our relationships with those around us, such that we will take practical steps to provide for their needs, both bodily and spiritual. The question for us then, brothers and sisters, is this: have we, as St. Gregory the theologian puts it, been hit with this arrow of love? Do we have the love of God and neighbor in our hearts? Amen.
Any questions for Father John?
Tenefisas Pater,
Lord bless you.
you made some great examples about love manifesting itself in such expressions, such as wanting to see someone as often as possible, wanting to put them before all things, wanting to do their will, sacrificing things for them, being disturbed by those who slander and oppose the one we love. And Saint Kosmas mentions that if someone was to swear at their mother or brother or father, they would forgive them. But if someone was to do that for God, doesn't even want to see them.
Yeah.
So can you give us some examples of how we could express our love for God in practical ways through the mystical and ascetical life?
Through
Through the mystical and ascetical life of the Church, what are the basic practical ways we can show this expression?
Well, I mean, the obvious ones are the works of mercy in terms of, like we said, clothing the naked, feeding the poor, looking out for the needs of our brethren who are, if not brothers in the font, especially those who are brothers in the font. We're told to look after first those who are of the household of faith, but then to our brothers by the order of creation, which are all our brother men and women. We look after them bodily and we look after them spiritually. In terms of preaching the gospel is also a work of mercy in that sense, and that we're trying to extend the kingdom of God to them. Through our preaching, that's also a work of spiritual mercy towards them. In terms of connecting it with the mystical and ascetical life of the Church, it raises an important issue, and one that sort of gets brought up in terms of an accusation against. Specifically against monastics sometimes. You'll hear it sort of said sometimes, how does a monastic who goes off, to live in a monastery express his love for brethren? Isn't that sort of just this type of weird isolationism or something like that? Wouldn't monastics be better served and be more loving if they were to, do, for example, what the papists do, where you have monasteries that are solely dedicated to social causes and things like that? Wouldn't that actually be more loving? Well, we know, number one, that if we're spiritual people, we believe that the most important thing that someone can do is prayer. And so if they're influencing the world by their prayer, that's a spiritual act of mercy and love of brethren, that we who are tied down by the weightiness of this life can't offer as readily for others. So the monastics offer very pure, a very pure offering to Christ for the sake of their brothers and sisters, and indeed for all the world, because of the straightness with which their prayers fly to the throne. So in terms of, if we want to tie it to the mystical life, where is this expression of love in this sort of ascetical life? One of the chief areas is prayer. But if you've gone to sort of the Cenobitic monasteries, you see that the way they live deeply depends on charity towards brethren. I mean, they take in pilgrims and give them respite from the world. They also, in terms of how they have to deal with each other, they deal with a great deal of charity towards one another, which is, also merciful in that sense. So yeah, in terms of in the world, we have one very particular way of doing it, which involves a lot of sort of the corporal, we might call them corporal acts of mercy, in terms of, feeding the hungry, providing for the poor, providing for the widows, visiting those who are sick and those who are in prison, and those who are ill, making sure their practical needs are supplied, that kind of way. And in the context of the monastic life, it's done in a slightly different way, with an emphasis on the spiritual things, and they're better equipped to offer those types of spiritual mercies and acts of love. So that sort of danced around things, but it's muted, so I can't hear anything, I don't think. Oh, it's still muted. There we go.
For those of us trying to live out the mystical and ascetical life in the world, I guess a simple formula would be, the more we love God, the more we want to go to church, the more we want to pray, the more we want to keep the prayer rule.
Yeah, I think that paragraph that I read to you from Metropolitan Augustinos is really a very perfect checklist for us, where he says, look, this is how we treat people. When we're in love with somebody in our life, this is the way we react to them. And he says, sort of basically go through those things and say, are we doing those things for God's sake? Are we trying to be in God's house? Are we trying to be in his presence? I.e., are we running to prayer? Are we running to church services? Are we making that an emphasis? Do we hang pictures? Do we have icons around us? Do we try to keep those things there to keep us from wandering? All those types of things. The other things you pointed out in terms of, do we easily tolerate people sort of that disparage the name of God and stuff like that, or do we, with love, try to set them right when they tend to do those things? All of that stuff is really important. But that paragraph, I think, is a really good basic summary.
And equally so, Father, how much are we disturbed when we don't do these things? How much
Yeah.
does it make us conscious?
Yeah, exactly. And that indicates the other thing for us. It indicates that we're probably far from the love of God in a way, if we're not doing any of those things.
Thank you, Father.
Anyone else? Very briefly, Father John, if you can maybe comment on today within the ecumenical movement that uses a lot of these arguments as to reasons why Christians should become one in terms for an external unity. Can you comment briefly on that?
I mean, it's said best by many others. But Father Theodore always used to tell us that one of the lines he would say over and over again was, we have to remember that love can't be separated from truth. Any love that takes place outside of and love is higher than truth, and truth is higher than love. So any attempt at love that's been segregated from truth isn't true love, isn't real love. And so what we sometimes have in the ecumenical movement is a love that's devoid of content. It doesn't have the truth, which provides it with power and stability. And so what we want to do is get to a point of developing relationships that are bound by truth.
How do we categorize that kind of pseudo love, or is it sick love? Like, what is there?
I think so. Sick love is probably fine. Misguided love. A misguided love.
Because we also see that many times, let's say, with parents and children, and especially the millennials, with a lot of trying to find a nice way of saying it, um, enabling them, right? Thinking
Yeah.
out of love. I think I like the way you said that, a misguided love, where they'll give them everything,
Yeah.
and except for Christ, and so in so doing, destroying them. But those situations are very, very delicate, right? Especially in the family unit, whether in your direct family or in your relatives. Um, how do we approach those situations? Because it's difficult. It's very delicate, especially the
Yeah.
relationship between child and the parent. A lot of times it may be the father, the mother-in-law, the father-in-law, the relationship with their children, and being in that type of dynamic.
Yeah, I think one of the ways, the best way to deal with it often, in my experience, at least my limited experience, has been that I think it's really important that those concern, number one, if the family doesn't have a relationship to a spiritual father, it's going to be extremely difficult. That's the first thing we have to come to a realization. If both spouses don't share a spiritual father, there's not a lot of chance of the situation coming out well. Because what you do see in some cases is parents that take completely opposing views. If they have one has a spiritual father and the other doesn't, or they have opposing, spiritual fathers who maybe don't agree about how to approach those things, the household just is a tornado. It's really, really hard to get to the bottom of those issues and come to a consistent way of. And it's not to say, what I'm not saying is that you have one spiritual father who's right and one's wrong. You might just simply have two different approaches in some cases. When each is trying to follow their spiritual father, it can end up creating a sort of conflict if it's not dealt with extremely carefully. But more often not, what you have is like one spouse who confesses and has a relationship to the church, and one who doesn't, or you have a situation where neither do, and they're trying to fix it sort of blindly. So the first issue is they need a common. Generally, it's really important to have a common spiritual father as a family, someone you can go to and say, look, this is the problem we're having. Someone who can hear both sides of it, who understands the souls of both people involved, and a sounding board that can help them sort of weed through how do we properly proportion this. Because like I said before, as Nico highlighted, a lot of times it's a misguided love. It's not that it's wrong. It's not that it's a completely perverse idea. There's got mixed up. And so you need someone just to step in and sort of put the right perspective on things. And so what I've even had in some cases, which is wonderful, I think, is I've had parents who will come and say, Father John, we're debating this issue about how things are going with the kids and how much emphasis should be on their activities and things like that. Would you come over some night and talk to us as a couple about that? That's great. And you get to listen to them, and you hear both sides of things, and you can see as a priest sitting there, you can see what's amazing is that you actually see how important the mom and the dad are. They might have different perspectives, but they both sort of, there's something about the mother's sympathy in most cases and the father's strictness or something like that. And if you can marry those two and get them to see the advantage that each other offer, they can very naturally come to a good conclusion about things. But they need that external person to step in and help them see that. Because as weak human beings, we tend to just see opposition. And we don't actually understand that, okay, no, there is actually something really valuable being offered by both sides. And if you can find a way of exploiting what both of you are offering, this is going to be a heck of a situation. It's going to be a really good situation. But again, some of that depends on their relationship to the church. But the easiest way to solve it, I think, is have a good relationship to a church, have a spiritual father whom you both trust, and make use of them. Sit down and ask these types of questions. Say, look, Father, we're spending this much time. We're missing church this often, and then lay it out. And he's going to sort of try to help you sort through. Because he also may, in some cases, he might show you, okay, where are areas that might not be ideal, but things that might be good compromises for where they are as a family. it's better to have someone helping you make those decisions than to try to make them ourselves usually.
Yeah,
Can I just
no, please.
Father Brigitte,
Yes.
it was very, very nice hearing these things, but also um, hearing these things can lead someone to a little bit of a despair, because that situation where the family unit are both spiritual mother and father, and they go see the spiritual father, is fantastic. But unfortunately, there's a lot of us, me included, where we're not in the same. We
Yeah.
happen to find ourselves in a different way. So it's not ideal at all, because
It's
you
very hard.
you're not in the spiritual level, or you're not in the same spiritual level. Even people of spirituality, there's still the challenges, but it's even a bigger challenge when your other half is not in the same way involved in orthodoxy the way that another person may be. So it's a constant struggle.
Yeah.
It's our it's a cross that we all have to bear. Uh, uh, but going back to what you said earlier, that the truth is larger than love, isn't it that love by nature, which is Christ, is truth? Love is
Yeah.
truth.
The
So
point is they're synonymous.
right. So if you have true love, true Christian love,
Yeah,
then you're by that you're being truthful.
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Father.
Yeah, real quickly, but I don't keep it much longer. What comes to mind with these struggles, either what Yanni mentions between husband and wife, or a parent with a child. We just celebrated Saint Augustine, Saint Monica, right? And it's those examples come up sometimes, and I struggle trying to figure out, okay, well, how far do we go with things? How far are we like Saint Monica, long suffering,
Yeah.
and then me being one quarter Spartan saying, oh no, we're going to start bringing the Hasukia, as we say in Greek, right? So how do where, because sometimes love is also a smack.
Yeah.
We even see God, he's love, and at times he allows little smacks here and there, not out of hatred, but because of our situation, that's the only thing that's going to wake us up. So I struggle with that. I don't want to go to either extreme, neither to be, a bleeding heart, neither to be a Spartan soldier on every situation. So it's a big struggle there.
Yeah. And I think though part of the thing is being honest with ourselves and realizing that we're in the midst of that struggle is part of the way we're acquiring grace to deal with those questions. When we become settled and sort of firm on a position and self-confident, that's when we can make a lot of mistakes, I think, with respect to these things, and being too forceful and not continuing to reevaluate the situation as it evolves. Because that's the other thing with kids, and that's one of the points I try to make to our parents quite a bit. Kids grow and they change fast in a lot of cases. And so the job of a parent, it's probably the hardest, most intensive job of anyone's life. You really, to be a good parent, you have to be on your toes. You have to be continually watching, not in the sense of a helicopter parent, not in the sense that you're trying to control every aspect of the child's life, but you have to be extremely watchful in terms of watching what's going on and be able to formulate a response to it. There's no downtime in that sense. There's no moment away from it. We need to be constantly praying about our kids and praying to God for our kids and thinking about them and asking for illumination to sort of figure out what's the best thing at this moment for this particular child, whom God has given us the care of. But yeah, it's really, really hard. But I think really part of it is being in that place, and being in that place of struggle and recognizing it and not becoming too firm, such that pride can very easily get in the way, especially when we think we're right. And then we can make mistakes because we start to force our will. When we're in that uneasy spot, it means we're always sort of watching and asking for guidance and adjusting. And I think that's, in a way, that's as uncomfortable as it is, that's probably not a bad place for a parent to be in essence.
Yeah, it's like shifting gears. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyone else for the? Okay, well, thanks for your patience again with us tonight. Hopefully, I shut off all the updates, so it shouldn't happen again. And if we could ask for your closing prayers, please.
O Christ, the true light, who dost enlighten and sanctify every man that cometh into the world, let the light of thy countenance be signed upon us, that in it we may behold the unapproachable light, and guide our steps in the performance of thy commandments, by the intercessions of thine all immaculate Mother, and of all thy saints. Amen. Kalinita kalihasikia ke tatapuma.
Okay, God willing, next week
I
we're good.
tell you, we have a vigil now next Friday, so I won't be on.
Okay.
Okay,
Well,
we'll
figure
it out.
it out. Kalita, thank you.
Night.